Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Rawlis with Avalara, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Before we get started, as a disclaimer, today's presentation is for informational purposes only and is not legal or tax advice. Joining us today is Nick Mergot. Nick is a Senior Strategic Alliance Manager at Avalara. Nick works with our partners to help identify mutual customers that can benefit from Avalara's tax and compliance solutions. He has over 20 years of experience with software and implementation. Nick also has experience working on Wall Street as an investment advisor, certified financial planner, and analyst. So you're definitely in good hands today. And with that, we are ready to get started, and I'll pass it over to Nick.
Hey, thank you for the kind introduction. And good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Certainly appreciate your time and hope this is informative. I always like to break my presentations down into the kind of three core aspects: the who, the what, and the why. Of course, you see the who, which is myself and kind of my background and profile. The what, we're going to dive into some of the renewable energy solutions that we're seeing out there, and more importantly, how that's affecting a lot of our customers and potential customers that we work with in the taxing industry. And then the why is important, is why should you care? Why should your customers care? And kind of the effects that we have on this. A couple of points I always like to pull up as far as with my bio. I've got a very functional background. I always like to highlight my Wall Street experience. I think it demonstrates my desire to partner with our clients as well as our partners to really drive a business value. If we think about digital transformation and why customers look at technology to resolve a lot of their problems, in a lot of that case, it is I'm investing money in a software solution or a business process that's going to improve efficiencies within our organization. And so from that, lots of times we're looking at an ROI or calculation on that. Lastly, I'll mention this. It's kind of a fun fact. For those of you that are college football fans, I'm a former 12th man, was a linebacker with Texas A&M back in the early 90s. And I can talk your ear off about any college football. As a matter of fact, you see me get real excited as we get closer to football season. All right. So with that being said, our presentation is going to break down into kind of three core parts. One, kind of the rise of blended and renewable products that we're starting to see as far as in the industry. Obviously, the EV movement, as I like to call it, the electric vehicle movement that you're starting to see more and more prevalent. And then, of course, the impact that it's going to have on not just convenience stores, but the industry as a whole. I will kind of lead you with, one tidbit, one takeaway. You're going to hear a lot of conversations around renewable fuel versus biofuel. They are two separate things. Okay, so if anybody tells you it's the same thing, no. Renewable diesel, biodiesel, okay, are two separate things. And that's one of the key takeaways that I'd like you to have as far as this presentation. All right. So what we've seen recently is new tax codes that's come out as far as the renewable industry. So renewable crude, sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, as you see, renewable diesel, renewable gasoline, and then, of course, a new exciting cutting edge one, which is this plastic liquefaction. And I'll spend a little time talking in regards to that. These are new forms and schedules, both on the state as well as the federal level. And, they're requiring customers as well as businesses, as far as their operations, to adjust their consumption as far as your traditional fuel or your biodiesel products. In there, kind of quick definitions, renewable crude is defined as a bio feedstock, such as various animal fats, vegetable oils, residues, things like that. I mean, we are starting to see kind of that cutting edge technology that's allowing us to go and take away what used to be considered a lot of waste products and convert that into fuel. Very important fact to note is that when you start talking about SAF or the renewable finding process with aviation fuel, it is an additional distillate process that they have to go through. So they create the fuel and then they, of course, go back in and they refine it. One of the things that we'll highlight on this is that when you look at the chemical compound of SAF versus jet fuel, it's the same thing. It's almost identical. So the nice thing about this is that you can use this as a blended product. You can use this as a straight fuel subsidiary. And then what the biggest challenge that you're going to see as far as with SAF is going to be supply. There's just not enough producers to be able to support that. When you start talking about taxing renewable crude, one of the reasons that more and more organizations are looking at it is because there's incentives in there as far as with the taxing agencies, as well as tax credits that they offer to that. But when you look at renewable crude, it's FTA code of R001, but you'll start seeing custom tariff codes for both crude and renewable fuels. And then the biggest thing that they start looking at is that it has to have at least over 50% non-hydrogen compounds. Okay, so building that product up, and then whether you're blending it or using it as a complete total fuel source, you need to have 50% of over non-hydrogen for it to be categorized as a renewable crude. Mixing those hydrocarbons, okay, elsewhere can be specified, included, but it also reduces the weight over 50% of a single hydrogen compound. All right. So I want to have a little fun here and kind of get into one of our first initial survey questions. So just internally, I don't need a show of hands or for anybody to speak out, but if you want to, you're welcome to. In this sense, can you name, a handful of cities or airports that are leading providers of SAF fuel or aviation fuel? I'm sure I'll give a few minutes. Sure, as some of you can guess, some of the areas that you're going to see most of this impact is going to be on the West Coast here in the United States. San Francisco and Los Angeles, actually LA was one of the first to embrace SAF fuel. But then you also have areas like Seattle, Oregon, Aspen, Denver, Houston, here, my own home city, as well as we start getting into European airports and cities. There's a huge impact as far as in Europe, where they're seeing massive consumption. And then, of course, in Singapore, Tokyo, Malaysia, Australia, and Auckland, New Zealand. Now, I'm going to spend a little time talking about kind of the why. When you start talking about, sorry, give me a second here, SAF or aviation fuel, okay? Before COVID, it's an estimate of 29,000 commercial aircraft were airborne. And of those 29,000, that carried about 4.5 billion passengers across the globe. We haven't reached those levels as of yet post-COVID. But then you're talking about, in addition to passengers, you're talking about 57.6 million tons of cargo were transported per year. That's about 40 million flights. Okay, so for anybody that loves numbers, the why behind this is a push to more renewable, more greener consumption as far as your fuels, and more importantly, lowering your CO2 footprint. Of all those flights, that same study, that same projection, basically came to the conclusion that air transportation was responsible for 12% of all transportation emissions and roughly about 3 to 4% of global CO2 emissions. So the aviation industry is taking some very aggressive goals. And one of the initial goals that you're going to see is that they want to be net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Sustainable aviation fuel is one of those areas that they're looking at. So when you start talking about SAF, the preferred renewed common petroleum synthesized jet fuel, think of it from this perspective. There's been a lot of talk about, say, hydrogen or the possibility of using electric. Both of those, the technology as well as the infrastructure is not there to sustain it. I don't know or can't imagine what an electric plane looks like, but the weight on an electric plane would have to be extremely light. And then more importantly, the destination, the length of that flight, how long could it sustain that flight path? In addition to the same thing as far as hydrogen, using hydrogen as far as in aviation, there's been talk about doing that. The infrastructure is not set up for that. But when you start talking about SAF, you start looking at, well, we already have the infrastructure in place. And a lot of the leading producers for SAF is going to be your traditional energy distilleries, refineries that you have in there, and they have the infrastructure in place to be able to provide that. The reasons I bring up some of those airports is to demonstrate to you that this is already something that's being used. And so when we talk about the ASTM, and of course I had to go back and look that one up, but the American Society for Testing and Materials, they've created the definition of what is a traditional SAF, and then what are the requirements as far as blending to allow it to be used as far as in aviation fuel. So we can go all the way back to 2016, and then even 2020, where both Los Angeles and San Francisco were some of the first two cities and airports to certainly use that. And then, of course, as far as the EPA's requirements, which is your RINs, or your Renewable Identification Number. And when I say RINs, think of it like a lot number. It's going to be tracking your tax credit. We have, at that time, 2020, an estimated 4.6 million gallons of SAF. I believe that number has doubled over the last several years, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's not closer into the 15 to maybe as much as 20 million gallons of SAF that's being consumed. Now, again, why is this important? Why should you care? Well, first and foremost, the government is offering a credit of $1.25 per gallon of SAF. So you need to be at least either at 50% or greater than 50% blending as far as SAF with your traditional jet fuel. And if you think about it from a margin or cost perspective, you've got $4, $5, sometimes $6 per gallon of jet fuel that you're using as far as on these transportations, on these flights, and you're getting $1.25 as far as in credit. It makes sense to look into this type of solution. It makes sense for the producers and your traditional oil and gas companies to be kind of that cutting edge and that leading edge for that. So when you get into the code as far as 100% SAF, you can see that down there, the Federal Tax Administration FTA code of SAF 00, or if it's a blended SAF XX. But there's a lot of different ways that you can get to this. So if you look at 7 different pathways that they're allowing for that tax credit, you can have SAF 100% blended. You can do various blends below the levels of 50%, above the levels of 50%. The other thing, too, that I didn't mention on the previous slide that is coming into effect is that once you start getting above 50%, not just, the $1.25 credits you receive, but you also get additional tax credit for the percentage of CO2 emissions that you lower. So if you're 51, 52, 65% SAF blended, as far as with your fuel, there is a calculation that allows you to demonstrate how much CO2 footprint that you've decreased, and that's additional tax credit that you can claim as far as on your returns. So, in a sense, this is really sexy stuff that a lot of companies, cutting edge companies, are looking into and taking a cutting edge as far as leading and providing not just the fuel, but the infrastructure to those airline companies that need it. Now, again, remember, I touched on this a little bit. Renewable diesel and biodiesel are not the same fuel. When you start talking about renewable diesel and biodiesel, biodiesel is basically built as far as a byproduct, and it's blended in a lot of these cases. So a very common one is going to be ethanol as a classic example. But when you start talking about renewable, those are going to be products that are built off of 100% renewable byproducts. And so when we get into when it meets this American standard 95 specifications for petroleum, that's when you start seeing a lot of the tax credits that are coming into play. The thought process behind it is that biodiesel has been something that's been promoted for the years, and that is being currently used as far as in a lot of our fuel consumption. Renewable is relatively new in this situation, and so they're going to be increasing the tax credits, and they want to encourage more and more consumers as well as businesses providing that renewable tax credit or those renewable diesels in them. These are breakdown as far as the tax codes for renewable diesel. As you can see, these are the Federal Tax Administration, or the FTA. Been to several of their meetings in the past. they're fun, but I mean, think of it as a collection of both industry as well as your departments of revenue, your departments of transportation, basically the audit folks at the various state agencies. And the whole premise behind it is they want to get together and create uniformity, which is tax codes that can be used across multiple state lines for organizations that are operating and trying to create a uniformity that makes it easier for those businesses to file and less taxing on us as individual consumers. You also get into renewable gasoline. A neat way of looking at it is that when you start talking about, renewable or jet fuel, jet fuel for the most part is really, really clean diesel, okay? And a lot of these are being monitored and regulated by this American Standard for Testing and Materials. That's kind of an agency that oversees a lot of it. But you're looking at the various renewable usages that organizations can incorporate it. Now, we're not seeing as much as far as renewable gasoline at the local retail or direct to consumer, but large freight, large shipping transportations are starting to embrace this, one, for the tax credit, and two, for the effect that it has on the environment. Plastic liquefaction. So this is cutting edge stuff. And again, I kind of want to give you the example of this solution here in the sense that businesses are actually investing in this technology as the capability of taking plastics. Let's just think of it as a plastic water bottle or a plastic container and liquefying that into a type of fuel that can be used. A lot of school districts are starting to look into something like this, specifically as far as the kids that attend that school, whether it's grade school, high school, can drop off their plastic bottles in these containers, and it will liquefy it into a form of fuel that can be used as far as the school bus. Again, the technology isn't there and the product's up there, but it is something that is coming. So right now, since this is not a fuel and therefore it's not taxed as a fuel, you can use it as a substitute. And I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head, but if someone wanted to, I could certainly get you some of the existing school districts here in the United States that are really looking into this and investing in it. But do not be surprised here in the next 5, probably 10 years, you'll start seeing more and more businesses look into plastic liquefaction. And if you think about it as far as your carbon footprint, now you're not creating a waste product that needs to be transported to a dump. It is pretty much dumped into this device that in essence liquefies that plastic bottle into a fuel source. All right. Let me spend a little time on this, kind of the rise of the electric vehicles. And, more importantly, this is kind of an area that I specialize in because I represent a handful of our excise partners. And this is a very, very common challenge. I call it the EV movement. Okay. The expectation is that 30%, and this is a big push by the EPA, but 30% of the vehicles driven here in the United States will be electric. They're using various tax incentives and various motivations as far as with the American consumers to move to electric vehicle consumptions. This puts a strain on our electricity grids. It certainly puts a strain as far as on the traditional oil and gas industries and even the convenience stores. And then most importantly, kind of the reason that we're discussing this is it puts a restraint as far as on the various taxing agencies. So the same FTA, departments of revenue, state agencies that use the motor fuel excise tax as a source of income to justify the infrastructure build out are losing revenue to a lot of these electric vehicles. So as you look into it, state revenues from fuel tax have been dropping over the last couple of years. Now, you have seen, and I can think off the top of my head, 3 states, and these are your traditionally progressive states, so Illinois, California, and New York, are all starting to look at ways of taxing, that electric vehicle consumption. And there's debate on, do we tax, energy surge as far as individual consumers, say at their house? Do we charge the charging stations? Do we charge them kind of a licensing fee? No one really knows. And an old mentor, a friend of mine, told me long ago, the government paints with a big, wide brush. And then it becomes down to the individual states, auditors, tax experts to figure out how that's going to have an impact on the individual consumers. So right now, they don't know what the correct answer is. And I wouldn't be surprised if you get a whole host of different options or viable options. One of which we've already seen as far as pilot programs in the state of both Oregon and California. They have what's called a vehicle mileage tax. So for those of you that basically are familiar with this program, this was a chip that went into your vehicle. And as you pulled up to the charging station or the pump, it would charge you a vehicle mileage tax, and then you would pay that at that pump or that charging station along with the electricity recharging for that. The challenge with that, you certainly think from the individual consumer standpoint, personal privacy. There's always conspiracy theory people out there that say, I don't want the government tracking where I'm going. But the most common thing is that, how genuine is that? If it's a chip, as far as in my car, what's to stop me from just taking that chip and throwing it out? And then that way, when I pull up to the charging station, all of a sudden I put it back in and now we're all good. So there's certainly, you can create some fraud situations in that. The other issue too is that you start talking about wear and tear on the roads and bridges and kind of the infrastructure. So what type of vehicle would cause the most wear and tear? You're going to talk about usually large freight or trucking and shipping from that standpoint. So, although the pilot programs have launched and they've talked about some of the success on it, they really don't know, how they're going to address kind of that shrinking revenue source that's got to be prevalent as far as the electric vehicle movement. In addition to that, you have the 18.4 cents per gallon or the Federal Highway Trust Fund. And in essence, the expectation and projections is that trust fund will come up with a shortfall by 2031, if not sooner. And so, a lot of talk as far as how that's going to adjust or change. And again, the common answer is that we don't know what the long-term effects they're going to have as far as the electric vehicles. Now, I kind of want to put this out there to the group. When you think about it, as far as the electric vehicle, probably some of you on this call may have an electric vehicle, probably a Tesla or, another electric version of this. I'm here in Texas, and, one of the biggest concerns that a lot of these electric vehicles have is going to be the power grid. Okay. When you start talking about rolling blackouts, okay, and some of the challenges you have there, the infrastructure is not there yet in order to address that. I heard this at an oil and gas conference with BP as well as SAP, and they talked about charging station anxiety. One of the biggest concerns you start talking about as far as, say, some of these long road trips. If I'm going to get on the road as far as my electric vehicle, I want to know there's plenty of charging stations along the way. And I'm trying to remember, I want to say Riven, R-I-V-E-N was the name of the company or the vehicle that did a demonstration of driving from the southern tip of South America all the way up to Canada. So through both South American countries, LATAM, as well as the U.S., and they were able to locate and map out their road trip as far as with several charging stations along the way. So, it was at one point a serious concerns. I could say that, I know that you could go to Google Maps and you can look and see where there's various charging stations out there as far as along your long road trips. So, but the tax piece of it is something that we are expecting to see a lot of adjustments or changes. All right, so I want to hit on our second survey question, okay? Some of you might be tax experts yourself or proficient as far as in the motor fuel tax industry, but just a quick question and give you multiple choice answers. What's the annual tax revenue collected from both states and federal government based off of the U.S. fuel tax or the excise motor fuel tax? Is it 1, 470 million, 2, 27.6 billion, 72.5 billion, 99 billion, or just under a trillion. Heck, some people might even say unknown. Nick, they're constantly changing the tax code. There's no way for them to project what those numbers are. So I can't put a number on that. Give you a few seconds. Think about it. Probably already know the answer. It's 4. It's 99 billion. And I kind of want to hit on it too, because 2 and 3, if you add them together, you'll get pretty close to 99 billion, that number. 27.6 billion is the projected estimate that the states and federal government collect off of diesel tax, and then the 72.5 is the gasoline tax that we as individual consumers or other consumptions use. So both those numbers together get you to that $99 billion mark. And the reason I hit on this is that expect both state and federal agencies to change that tax code and that federal tax requirements, as well as the filing forms, as they're starting to roll and encourage more and more consumers to either move to renewable fuels and at the same time collect off of that electric vehicle consumption. Now, how is this going to have impact as far as your traditional businesses? Well, what we're starting to see is more and more of your convenience stores, which I think of them as your traditional fuel providers, are embracing some of these changes. They too have some of the same challenges that you think about it, but when you start looking at large organizations, big C-store operators, so like your 7-Elevens, your racetracks, your Loves, your travel, your TAs, I mean, all of those organizations are looking at various ways that they can address this electric vehicle consumption. And Tesla has been one of the leading providers as far as some of these portable charging stations. You also have other vendors in this space that are providing this as well. If you think about it, from a C-store operator, their highest margin are going to be on the products that you purchase inside the store. So you go in and you buy a Nutter Butter or a Twinkie, a cup of coffee, some chips, all the snacks that a C-store sells are all their high margin, high profitable. So they love the idea, of having a active customer or a customer stuck at their convenience store for the next 20, 30, sometimes even more, 40 minutes. There was a recent article in NACS, the National Association of Convenience Stores organization, and they were talking about, so is it better to put in a better quality charging station? So like, for instance, Tesla is considered kind of top of the line that allows a customer to get in and out within 15 minutes, 20 minutes, fully charged? Or is it better to put in a lower quality charging station that keeps that customer there longer, because they're an active customer the longer they're there waiting on their car to kind of fully charge? Nobody knows what the right answer is, but there is certainly a cost that you invest in any of these charging stations. And then the other challenge too is that you start looking at real estate. For some C stores, they're jam-packed. There might be 1, 2, 4 bays of fuel centers, and they may take out one of the bays as far as a fuel island or that fuel center, and they may put in a charging station from that. But then how do I get that electric consumption directly to that? I kind of laughed at it. There was one that actually said you could hook up a diesel generator to these charging stations, thus kind of negating the whole green energy and less consumption as far as fossil fuels. But you have a diesel generator hooked up to your charging station, and then that way you can replenish that charging station for consumers over the next several days, if not months. But we are starting to see a lot of these electric vehicles, these changes start to come into play, and these changes are not going to happen quickly. The selling of electric cars, there's still an element of individual consumers out there that just don't trust the vehicle. They don't believe there's going to be enough infrastructure to be able to support that, or the electric grid will not be able to support that. There's also some financial challenges around purchasing an electric vehicle. They tend to be on the expensive side. And then also with these EV stations installing, a charging station anywhere between 3 to 13,000. You can certainly add some cost to that if you were charging it, but you're also starting to see not just convenience stores, but various restaurants and even shopping centers have these electric charging stations. And of course, if you were in one of the 3 previous states I mentioned, like Illinois, California, or New York, you certainly have some excise tax that's going to be associated with those charging stations. We did see recently here that 7-Eleven made an announcement that they would have 500 charging stations at well over 250 locations. And 7-Eleven is traditionally thought of as the 800-pound gorilla as far as in the C-store space. They have the most locations, not just here in the United States, as well as globally, I believe. For me locally here in the state of Texas, Buc-ee's. I don't know if anybody on the call has ever been to a Buc-ee's. They're kind of a cult down here in Texas. But Buc-ee's sells everything that you can possibly imagine in their convenience stores. And they have a lot of real estate as far as available. So what they've done is they've contracted with Tesla, and you will start to see at most, if not all, Buc-ee's stations, especially as far as the state of Texas and surrounding states. And I believe they operate in close to 20 something states. But Buc-ee's is starting to put these charging stations in place because they want the consumers to come inside the store and make that purchase. Additional services, that could be expanded as far as the convenience stores or restaurants, certainly your retail locations, expanded product offerings, rentable workstations. So if you think about it, someone like myself that spends a lot of time on the road traveling, and I may pull up to, say, a travel centers. Well, they have, makeshift offices that I can rent, give me a Wi-Fi capability so I can conduct webinars, much like this, to my audience. You get into some auto detailing as far as the vehicle, loyalty rewards, and then strategic C-store locations. There's a lot of different possibilities and options to that. And again, I will hit on my first point, my middle point, and kind of my last point. Renewable fuel and biodiesel are 2 separate things that you'll see out there. All right, with that being said, are there any questions?
Thank you, Nick, for the great presentation. We're now going to take this time to answer any questions you may have. We had one that came in during your topic about different tax revenues. The question was, so with electric cars, does that revenue go away, or how does that affect the revenue that states are depending on?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. To be honest with you, we don't know. I can tell you, talking with the various administrators, and departments of revenue, they're not going to let that revenue go away. They're going to find ways to pass legislation in order to collect it. One of the most common ways that we're starting to see is an annual fee that they charge to electric vehicle drivers. Or, there's questions, should we charge kind of the charging station? The easiest thought process is that currently right now, what you do is you charge the C-store. So that is the end supply chain as far as in that fuel distribution. So you create a refined product from the refinery. It gets shipped via a truck to, say, that C-store, and then that C-store sells it. And then that tax is, in essence, baked into the price as far as the fuel. So if they follow that same pattern, the same logic, then the argument would be as people pull up to that charging station, they would be charged an excise tax. It would probably be relatively small, but as that revenue dropped from fuel consumption, it would certainly rise as far as in the electric vehicle movement. And so, but you think about it from a geopolitical to various challenges for our state legislation, getting that passed, a tax passed, is not as easy, but somehow the government finds a way.
Great, thank you. Someone was also wondering about how we found the average cost of installing like an EV charger, like what factors go into that price point?
Well, I mean, I guess if I go back, maybe they're referring to this right here, the 3,000 to 13,000. This was pulled from a recent study, and then we had discussions as far as with some of our C-store operators. I would believe that since it is relatively a new thing as far as charging stations and installing these charging stations, the cost of that is going to gradually go down. As consumers go up, you're going to have more entries into the marketplace. I continue to refer to Tesla, but I know they're not the only one that provides various charging stations out there. And so there'll be a push, and there's businesses dedicated directly to this to get into this space. And I'm not as familiar on tax credits that you get on the charging stations. Again, I would not be surprised at the federal or state level, especially in a lot of those progressive states that I mentioned, that there will be some sort of tax credit provided to you, because they certainly provide it to the consumer on the front end as far as purchasing that electric vehicle. They certainly would want to provide it to the infrastructure of the provider of that charging station. So, yeah, I can send you the link to this individual that we use to pull this data. But I think that was just from a study that we had, as well as confirmation from some of the C-store operators.
Great, thank you. And with all these changes happening too, what trend do you think will kind of pick up the most you see next? Like, would it be just more stations? Do you think more tax talk? Or what do you think for electronic vehicles, what's kind of on the horizon next?
Yeah, so for me personally, and it was just kind of an interesting discussion at this same BP/SAP conference, you'll see more and more electricity providers, so your traditional utility providers and oil and gas companies get together, merge together. So your big super majors, Shell, BP, Exxon, Chevron, Phillips 66, ConocoPhillips, will start getting into joint ventures and efforts with electricity providers. So I'm thinking traditionally down here in Texas, so your TXUs, your center points, every state, every county has different ones, but they will partner with them to be able to provide enough electricity to keep those charging stations in place. I think because the infrastructure is already there, you'll start seeing more and more C-stores embrace that and kind of move to that. I know a couple of years ago when we were in the pandemic, putting on my old Wall Street hat, there were various electricity charging stations doing joint contracts with McDonald's and various retail outlets. And the thought process is that, well, this would be the perfect time in a post-COVID environment when not as many people are traveling, in order to create and develop that infrastructure and put these charging stations in place. And there were several stocks that you could acquire and make a significant profit because they would sign huge long-term contracts with these traditional brick and mortar store and operators. I still think that's going to be the case. I think that your traditional fuel providers are going to be leading the way. And I think that you will start seeing more and more of a marriage in this environment, especially as long as the government is providing these tax credits and these tax incentives. Great,
thank you. And with that, that is the final question we have for today. So do you have any final words as we wrap up here?
No, again, I want to thank everybody for this. I hope this was informative. Certainly feel free to follow up with your account team here at Avalara, or you certainly can follow up with me. My last name, Mirgaux, Mirgeaux. I think I'm the only one out there. I jokingly say Thibodeau, Boudreaux, Mirgaux, we all go down to the bayou. But you can contact me at nick.mirgaux, Mirgeaux, at avalara.com. And I'm happy to kind of follow up with you as far as additional questions or concerns, or more importantly, get you to the right spot as far as your situation.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks again for being with us today, and we will see you in a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.